Okay, welcome back everybody. Next up, I'd like to introduce Mike Finn from our presenting sponsor Deloitte for their take on our topic of convergence this year. If you've been around the show in the last couple of years, you probably already know Mike. He culminated his military career as the PACAF Chief Information Officer. And then he was kind enough to come out here to Colorado Springs and act as my advon when I followed him a few years after that, looking for my retirement job. No, seriously. Mike settled here in the Springs, linked up with Deloitte, and now he is a specialist leader in their cyber risk services. So let me turn it over without any further ado to this point to him and his panel for their take on our topic of convergence. Mike?
Hey, thanks, Rich. Big thanks to Rocky Mountain FCF for pushing through the COVID challenges and still having this conference, even if it's virtual. We're pleased to be able to sponsor the conference once again, and we're looking forward to next year to actually be at the Broadmoor. I've seen a couple folks out there, and I'm a little envious. I guess I could have put pants on and come down there myself, but in any case, I also want to thank our technical support for making a virtual conference possible. We have a great panel today. We've got Ahmad Swan, and Keith Watts. Unfortunately, Sean Tursky had to bail out at the last minute for family reasons. But I'd just like to open with some thoughts around about convergence, and I think this is a great topic that FC is bringing up for the conference. Cyber and intel convergence is really kind of a necessary artifact or consequence of our ability to more deeply exploit operations in the information domain. So the connective tissue is around information. And I can remember as a young lieutenant and captain, and working at the joint staff early on, and working on information dominance, information warfare, information operations, and even then we understood that this notion of where our work in this community matters is in information. As a result, the relationship between cyber and intel, it's symbiotic. Intelligence operations leverage the cyber domain to gain information both in the exquisite sense and in the public sense against our adversaries. And then in cyber operations, across the spectrum, offensive, defensive, dodent ops, all have to be intel driven. Our continuing maturity in defensive operations stems from the necessity to protect missions and related information, and therefore we have to focus on users, systems, applications, and data. And we increasingly need to employ concepts of warfare, including deception and maneuver, to maintain advantage in the cyber domain. And as we need actionable intel, and even in order to understand our adversaries' threats and capabilities. And while these operations are often technical and provide exquisite sensitive intelligence, we also see the necessity to glean information in the public domain as cyber operations are increasingly extended into public cyberspace. On today's panel, Keith and Ahmad will help us explore the challenges of identifying, collecting, and disseminating timely and actionable cyber threat intel, and hopefully help address the cyber intel communities and how they should innovate and improve effective cyber effectiveness for cyber defenders at the tactical edge. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Keith Watts. Keith is with Deloitte. He's a data and operations strategist. He's been with Deloitte for about 4 years, working enterprise data strategy and force optimization projects across what used to be Space Command and is now Space Forces, and in the Air Force, focused on ACC and 16th Air Force, and really focusing on how to converge ISR, cyber, IO, and EW disciplines. Prior to Deloitte, Keith was 27 years in the Air Force active duty as an intelligence officer. He served in the ISR division in Air Operations Centers. He's been in intelligence communities particularly down as the Air Force commander at NSA Georgia, and as the Space Command's director of intelligence, and then culminating as the deputy director for the integrated airspace, cyberspace, and ISR operations at Air Force Space Command. He spent years building and leading the operations and IT infrastructure for DGCS. So he's kind of like a comm guy. And so he's near and dear to my heart. So Keith, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And, it's funny, I laughed. My first brush with the communications world, not even IT, was as a young officer being handed a UHF TACSAT radio and being told to deploy and set up comms and start beaming back intelligence from the jungles in Central and South America. But you mentioned my time with the Air Force DCGS world, and there I helped set up the global network that enabled the airborne ISR mission to fly and be seamless through its reach back capabilities, and it was really much more of an IT focus. But as it happens in careers, timing is everything. And I ended up at NSA Georgia at a very important time. And that's when General Alexander had decided to formally stand up the Cyber Mission Force. So I was a commander on the intel side of the house with people under my, that I was serving with, who effectively were doing intel support to cyber operational missions. But then we started dividing up the world, right? And so certain of my people left and sort of put on a cyber hat, never to return. Others stayed on the intel side of the house. And when I left that, I had an interesting perspective arriving at the time Air Force Space Command, where shortly after arriving, we actually merged our directorates of operations, ISR, and cyber and IT into a single directorate. So I had converging those capabilities formally in my job title. So I went from being a mission owner, fighting to keep the resources I needed to do the ISR and intel mission, to actually organizing, training, and equipping not just the ability to train intelligence professionals to support cyber, but also the cyber side of the house as well, working with 24th Air Force from the headquarters. Since joining Deloitte for almost, it'll be 2 years this April, we'll have focused on bringing together 24th and 25th Air Force into 16th Air Force, helping General Hawk and team down in San Antonio with their convergence mission. And a couple of interesting things have come up in that work. And first is that it's not just a merger and acquisition. It's a holistic approach to embed those missions and capabilities. And that means putting together not just the mission capabilities and helping with an organizational design and infrastructure that enables that, but also working with the workforce, whether it's talent acquisition, workforce optimization, training. It runs the entire gamut, and even all the way down to the data layers and what data needs to be present to help either mission side, whether it's a pure ISR or cyber or a converged mission. And what's fascinating is that as these two capabilities came together in 16th Air Force under General Hawk, the intent was never that it's just an intel cyber organization. It was an information warfare organization, to where with electronic warfare and information operations, you're bringing together 4 disciplines, and weather, I guess, is a 5th, bringing together those disciplines to create outcomes that are greater informational outcomes than any pieces of those on their own could present. So there's a lot to this topic. I really look forward to kind of diving in on this panel and working with Ahmad and you and kind of teasing some of these things out. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Keith. Our next panelist is Ahmad Swan. He's the chief of the Missile Defense Agency cybersecurity service provider and their computer emergency response team. Mr. Swan directs the defensive cyber operations, internal defense measures, activities for the Missile Defense Agency in support of DoD, U.S. Cyber Command, and Joint Forces DODN operations. He executes defensive cyber operations for all MDA common use general services networks, research, development, testing, and engineering networks, and mission systems networks worldwide. Prior to joining the Missile Defense Agency, he planned, managed, and led cyber operations across multiple Air Force organizations, including Space Command, ACC, AMC, PACAF, USAFE, and AFCENT. and several deployments to Southwest Asia. And then he was at DISA for some time, where he continued the cyberspace activities around planning and execution of cyber operations. Ahmad is, like Keith, a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy and still serves in the Air Force Reserves. Ahmad, over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Mike. Okay, good morning, everyone. As you mentioned, I'm Ahmad Swan. I'm the chief of the Missile Defense's CSSP and the CERT. So what we do there is I'm leading the defensive cyber operations across the agency. Now, yesterday I was listening to a couple of the panels, and during, I think it was Lieutenant General Whiting's panel, he mentioned something that really hit home with me. He said that as cyber leaders, we need to start applying more focus to our weapon systems. And I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. Now, in my background in the Air Force, I was actually part of the stand-up of the 561st Network Operations Squadron, or INOSC West. And so that was my introduction really to IT. I was a young lieutenant, then captain, learned quite a bit about IT. We had several huge efforts to try to consolidate networks in Air Force Space Command at the time. Now, I was there during all the patch changing, right? I went from ASPACE to ACC probably 4 different times. But ultimately, we learned a lot about what it takes to run NIPRNet, what it takes to operate SIPRNet. And so I learned a lot about IT at that moment. Later on in my career, spent a lot of time with DISA. So we were in charge of operating all the DoD IAPs under DISA's management. So we're talking 12 different IAPs, consolidated down to 10 IAPs. And so these are the gateways for all the traffic going in and out of the DoD. So obviously I learned a lot about IT there, and I got a chance to lead an organization that supported such a large IT infrastructure. A big experience I took from that was, with all the data we're getting at those IAPs, we had very little threat intel to help us prioritize, how we're going to defend those IAPs. You're looking at traffic from the entire Department of Defense. So if we wanted to be able to mitigate threats, the threat intel that we're getting, it was a struggle. So that's why this panel, I have a lot to say about this. I have a lot of passions when it comes to trying to merge cyber and threat intel, because I've seen what happens when you can't do that. Now, working in MDA, the director's number one goal in MDA is to support the warfighter. And as an acquisition agent for the missile defense system, that support is done through development and deployment of MDS. And what does that mean? All right, so we're taking platforms like C2BMC, GMD, we're developing the next version of those, and then working with the warfighter to operationalize them. And that's a huge mission. It's fun. I enjoy it every day. But if you're paying attention to the news, there are a lot of adversaries interested in what the U.S. is doing for our missile defense. Every day, you'll probably see a story related to this topic. They're watching how much money we're spending, how much money Congress is approving. They're watching how we're maneuvering all of our systems. But even more, they want to know where we're going in the future with MDS. So that presents an opportunity for them. At the same time, as a defender, we understand what they're looking for. So as the CSSP lead, I'm tasked to provide that tier 2 level defense. That's the ability to understand the adversary's capabilities and intent. That's huge for me. If we don't understand the capabilities and intent, which direction are we going to go into? So what's even more important for me is the need to fuse all of that data into our daily cyber operations. Now, like a lot of you, face a lot of challenges, and since we're an acquisition agency, the biggest challenge for me is responsiveness. We see these new threats every day, but how quickly can you respond to those threats? How quickly can you maneuver within your domain to defend against those threats? So a large part of our mission, it involves IT networks that are in development. These are labs dispersed across the country or even the world. And these labs are designed to replicate and stay synchronized with the operational mission systems. So when it comes to responding to threats, how do you make those changes quickly when each of those labs tend to have their own contract, right? Their own contract support? And each one of those contracts has its own unique requirements. Some of those requirements say, hey, we can't make these changes, but every so often, maybe every 30 days, maybe every 90 days, but whatever it is, it's unique to that particular lab in that particular system. All this presents a huge challenge in responding to these threats. Now the solution, and hopefully we can talk through these solutions today and several ideas, but it has to include ensuring, contract language includes modern cyber requirements and ability to respond to these threats. But it also has to include prioritization. Right? We have to understand how to prioritize our efforts, prioritize our resources. But as we're going to talk about today, leveraging that threat intel to choose our battles wisely, to understand, what is the actual urgent priority? What should we get to first? And in a world where we're dealing with much more data, we need to be able to prioritize and understand what's urgent. Yeah, that's why I'm looking forward to this discussion today. And Mike, I'll hand it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Ahmad. I think it's really helpful to have, both a predominantly intel perspective and a predominantly defensive cyber perspective on the panel today. And I think that for both panelists, maybe you could just talk for a few minutes about, where you think the current gaps are in cyber threat intel. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And maybe some of those key enablers you think that are out there that we should exploit.
Yeah, thanks. And just hearing kind of Ahmad walk through some of his perspective on what he's looking at, I couldn't agree more on the need and the ability to prioritize and the reliance on, what overall is traditionally an intelligence role, which is helping provide, indications and warnings and analysis that would help someone prioritize. I think one of the challenges has long been taking an intelligence discipline that for ages has been, tends to be very focused, not necessarily on purely geographies, but on, an adversarial focus, right? And so whether it's a cyber threat actor specifically, or if it's just, the global competition that we're ongoing right now with China and Russia. There's always been a fundamental difference between cyber, which can come from anywhere and manifest itself anywhere in the world. Space is the same way. With intelligence training that was traditionally, at least in the Air Force, built around a squadron level where you've got air crews and others who are about to go step in an aircraft, fly over a very specific terrain, which has specific threats there, and that your mission is designed to enable their safe execution of their operational mission and return. So contrast that with 5 years ago roughly, as the cyber ops squadrons were standing up at Scott Air Force Base, and intelligence officers straight out of intel school were being assigned there and being told, you are now an intel officer supporting cyber. And both sides of the aisle, the intel and the cyber sides, kind of didn't know what to do with that, right? The training at the time on the intel side didn't really, the tradecraft wasn't developed to the extent that you could put someone in front of a queue of packet captured data and then have them start deriving useful things, right? And so there was an immediate need and effort built around, what does on-the-job training look like? What does initial qualification and IQT, MTQT type things look like? How do you mature and when do you declare victory for an intelligence analyst who is now all of a sudden supporting a mission area that, to them up to that point was probably very foreign from the types of training. They're trained to stand up as briefers, or they're trained to support, understand what a integrated air defense system looks like and how it operates. Not necessarily trained on what to look for inside a network that indicates an adversary is inside, wreaking havoc. And so, to me, training and the tradecraft around, especially defensive cyber support from an intelligence career field, is one of those hard things to do. Ahmad, just kind of curious your reaction as the recipient of some of that support, kind of if you've got a similar perspective or no.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, training is since the beginning of time, right? That's always been a huge issue. So for the cyber defense side of things, we've always had trouble getting the right information. Part of that is that we're not in the right room, right? So most of the cyber defenders don't sit in SCIFs. That creates a huge challenge. And if we do have, some sort of a liaison on our ops floor, that creates the same problem for that liaison. He might come from the intel world and might have all the right information, but he doesn't have it at his fingertips because he's sitting in a secret environment. And it's funny you mentioned training, because classification was my first thought when Mike mentioned what kind of gaps do we have today inside the threat intel. The first thing I thought about was classifications. And when I say classifications, what I mean is where we sit, where we're fighting from, what our environment we're sitting in. Most cyber defenders working at the tactical level, anybody can attest, having that actionable cyber threat intel at an unclassed or even just a secret level, that's tough. It's a challenge. We're used to the tear lines, but with the tear lines, you're losing a lot of context. So most intel organizations clearly operate at the TS level and sit in SCIFs. So most of these DoD cyber defenders, if they're not sitting in a SCIF, they're missing out. They're not in those same spaces. So what you end up with is this chasm between the cyber and the intel worlds. And I'd say the positive over the last few years, something I've seen that's really helped us out at the tactical level is the new CISA. I think it's the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency. They've done a great job of sharing unclass level IOCs, just general cyber threat intel. They've also been really effective in bridging between the DoD and the industry partners. And then whenever something happens with industry partners, they've been able to gather timely cyber intel and post it on their site. And that site's open to basically anyone in the government, federal government, industry. You can go there for the same IOCs. And that's been pretty cool. But clearly there's lots of room for improvement, right? While there's been some development in some DoD organizations, there's still just not a standardized or effective method for getting data and pulling information quickly from a TS environment down to an unclassed or secret environment. And of course, that's where all the DCO tools are. So that's where our room for improvement I see for the DCO perspective. But having that integration and closely tied with the threat intel analysts, that's huge for us.
Yeah, one of the things I think is really a net positive is on the intel side of the house, realizing that a lot of the traditional tradecraft and techniques that exist, kind of understanding what the cyber analog of those is. Little things like realizing, it might not be obvious to someone on the intel side that, an IP address resolves to something specific, and that through other bits of information, you can oftentimes pinpoint what geography it came from. And so it starts to feel a little more like the traditional skills and capabilities that people learn on the intel side of the house as they, go through their careers. So I think that growth in tradecraft is good. The other thing that I think is just really amazing is, in kind of to your point, Ahmad, about being in the vault versus outside on the ops floor, not in the vault, and trying to get those worlds to come together is kind of the amazing variety and depth of tools that exist now that are commercial based, that are based on things like social media. And while, just using social media as an example, while that does bring some challenges on the IC side of the house in terms of intel oversight, there are ways to do information, indications and warning, tipping and queuing, alerting, those types of things that are based on parameters that are not necessarily, or parameters and sources that are not necessarily traditional intel sources. And so I think that helps bring those worlds together, and to the degree that you can sort of automate at a data level some of those warnings and places to look. I think it really broadens your ability to react and ultimately secure the networks and the cyber capabilities that you need to do your mission.
Yeah, and one point you mentioned automation and tipping and queuing. I think that's another area where we've made quite a bit of improvement. So in the past, we've had a lot of tools, DCO tools that sit in our environments, but they're in various stovepipes. What I've seen now is a growing trend towards those COTS tools with automated feeds with the vendor. Right now, granted, a lot of our feeds are one way, so we're not able to fully contribute to the larger community, but we are able to benefit from some of these vendors who have large subscriber bases across the world. When they see activity happening on one side of the world, if we have that automated threat feed, we're able to pull that data in very quickly. So I mean, nowadays, most of these COTS tools are built around the idea of defense through collaboration, which is that frequent two-way communication for activities and vulnerabilities and threats. Now, this tends to result in a much more rapid threat-based signature and control measure development process. But the challenge is always, the more data you get, you still got to respond to all that data. And that data exchange, goes counter to some of our traditional information protection standards, right? Like we used to say, hey, we don't want the adversary to know what our vulnerabilities are, and we still don't. But if you're trying to tip back to your vendor or to the larger community, there is a risk of exposing some of that vulnerability information. So that's kind of the trade-off of having that advanced automation feed and typically queuing with the vendors that we're investing so much money in.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I think, as I listen to the conversation, I want to tease out what do we think convergence looks like in this space, particularly when you think about, DOTA ops as being a maneuver force and the concepts that, of defense, concealment, those, aspects of traditional warfare and how they can be applied to cyberspace. And in traditional warfare, that's all intelligence driven. And so what does convergence look like for our operational, net ops and DCO forces?
Yeah, and so I'll start from a perspective where, at least within 16th Air Force, the way that the team there is looking at convergence, and that's the ability to leverage, whether it's ISR or cyber, EW or IO, leverage those capabilities in a way that actually improves your effectiveness and gives you a functional capability that was greater than what you started with in any single one of those domains or stovepipes. And so the wins that we're seeing, and I'm sure General Hawk has talked about, is that the ability for airmen inside 16th Air Force who have a convergence mission to take information out of one of those bins, whether it's traditional ISR or traditional cyber, and actually crosswalk those internally and then share across combatant commands through the planning elements that are embedded at those combatant commands. Like, to me, those are clear victories because they're getting beyond some of those geographic constraints that I talked about earlier. They're creating value that didn't exist in one or the other stream when looked at just by themselves. And I think that ends up being hugely important in that discussion. And I don't, I do think it's worth mentioning really that both ISR and cyber are part of a greater ability to wage information warfare in the global competition phase that we're in right now. And so that while you have to have the ability, to use your language, you have to be able to use the DOTA to maneuver and deliver effects, and those might be, and defend yourself while you're doing it, and those effects might be manifested in a number of different ways, kinetically and non-kinetically. At the end of the day, it can all be undone easily with an information campaign on the other side, whether it's China, Russia, or some other actor, public or private. And so I think keeping that in mind is always got to be part of the discussion, the equation.
Go ahead, Mod.
Hey, Keith, I totally agree with everything you said. That makes a lot of sense with me. And one of the things that you said that rang a bell with me was the geographic boundaries, right? So working in MDA, one of our missions is defending, the development labs, but also those mission systems. And as you know, the MDS, that weapon system, that spans across multiple countries, multiple geographic commands, service departments. So when it comes to cyber defense, J2 is a huge part of that. Understanding what the threat is, what the adversary's intent is, plays a huge role. But when you talk about a system that crosses over all those different boundaries, you don't just need one J2. Like I need threat intel coming from Indo-PACOM. I need it from UCOM. I need it from NORTHCOM, STRATCOM. Like all these organizations are key stakeholders in what's going on with the missile defense system. Each of them have their own J2s. They have their own priorities, their own requirements, intel requirements. But all that has to play a role in the cyber defense because that one system supports all those different operators. And on top of that, one thing that we've always kind of lacked, but when I talk about convergence, what I need to understand is kind of the psychology behind the APT. And when I say psychology, I don't mean anything other than just, what their real intent is. We talk a lot about capabilities. I think we've got a pretty good idea of cyber capabilities for various APTs. And that's something that's tangible, at least in the cyber world. You can kind of put your fingers on it. You understand what that looks like. You understand software, and we understand, the exploitation code. But on the flip side, understanding the APT's intent, that's way more challenging. That's much more difficult to get your hands on, and you end up with a lot of predictive analysis. But when we're able to better understand, what the APT's intent is, what they want to do with the exploitations that they're deploying, how they want to maneuver, and what information is valuable to them, I think that's really helpful for us. And a great example, we just had this recent SolarWinds related exploit. I think everyone's pretty familiar with it. It's one thing to have a playbook and to look for, known malicious DLLs or, different types of IOCs that you're looking for in your network. But that's the way we've been doing business for a long time. I think with convergence, you got to take that next step in the analysis. So using, like the MITRE attack framework, understand, what the objective is and what kind of technique the APT is using, and then try to attribute that to the actor. At least at that point, you have a much better chance with your predictive analysis of knowing how to prioritize your cyber defenses, your resources, where to put all your effort, and then just leveraging all that to improve your overall cyber posture. But that's how I see convergence between cyber and intel.
Yeah, and Ahmad, sorry, Mike. I was just going to say one of the things that you mentioned really sparked a thought, and that is, using your Indo-PACOM example, like, regardless of where the threat might be coming from, that threat actor, if you will, isn't bound by any specific geography either, right? And so there's a blurring of government, public, and private. Whether it's Chinese semi-private organizations or Russian proxies that look private but aren't. And so the boundaries of what your intelligence apparatus is pointing at specifically has to be broad by definition. You've got to kind of look at all sides and everywhere as well, because it's not limited to coming out of the Moscow region of Russia or something. It can be manifesting from any place, including within the U.S., which itself is raises some challenges. But what it really does to me, and I think this is probably colored by my experience at Deloitte in the last 4 years, is kind of working on the data side of the house, is that you've got to have an apparatus that allows you to deal with the vast quantities of data that sort of wide of an intel net that you're casting, brings in, right? Whether it's just information about the network and who's in it, the actual technical kind of details that you need to defend, or whether it's all the other tipping and queuing and all the other indicators that would reveal that something is happening, that there's an operation ongoing. Those data needs are vast, and if you don't have an infrastructure to manage your metadata, your master data, your architecture to bring it all in, a way to vet the quality of the data. You don't want to be chasing down Twitter bots as your main adversary if it's just a bot, right? And so the ability to distinguish those types of things really gets at the core of an ability to be effective. You can do things and think you've found the whole piece, but unless you've got really an underlying data strategy and architecture that allows you to be holistic, then you're kind of in trouble, and you may not even realize it. Just because of the power of the analytics, they're only as good as kind of what you're applying them against in your test sets.
Yeah, thanks, gentlemen. And we're getting close on our time, so I do want to give a little bit of time for kind of final thoughts, maybe a couple minutes each, and but maybe think a little bit or include in your final comments where do you think the future holds with, as technology advances, cloud, and where do you see us going? Ahmad, why don't you start us off?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Mike. So where do I see us going? I think the next step is, machine learning, AI, everything that Keith just mentioned is exactly where we need to go. So the idea with cloud computing, with AI, machine learning, is you're ingesting so much data, right? We're trying to bring in a lot more data than we ever have. Now, there's a lot of advantages to that, right? So we know that we're probably not going to be able to keep up with the data personnel-wise, staff-wise, and people's brains aren't going to progress with the speed of cyber and with the speed of what we're doing with data. So what we have to do is get better with our processing. And machine learning and AI is a huge piece of that. With all the rapidly advancing cyber technologies, dealing with more data, can't expect staff to grow, but we got to do something. So we have to invest in ways to process, analyze that data faster, more efficiently, and get to the needle in the haystack a lot quicker. And in the industry selling this right now, it's got to be machine learning, artificial intelligence. Now, of course, there's some disadvantages with that, but there's always some sort of immediate gain, but we have to keep in mind those disadvantages that come with having all that data, maybe in one cloud provider. Right? So we're not the only ones using machine learning and AI. Our adversaries are using that too. So since we're not the only ones, what kind of risk comes along with that? So it's easy to say both it's advantageous and it's a disadvantage to go with that. But I think the bottom line, we should be able to identify threats faster. We should be able to respond to threats quicker with the use of machine learning and AI. But again, it's like an arms race. Right? This is like a consistent arms race with the adversary. We're both trying to leverage the same technology to defend. They're trying to exploit the same technology to exploit us. So when it comes to the malicious actors, they've got more capability than ever. They got the ability to adjust and evolve to attacks just as fast as we have the ability to adjust and modify our defenses. So this is going to give us fits, but there's certainly plenty of room for opportunity here. And I think that's where we're going next. Now, when I say we, I mean greater DoD. While the Air Force and different services have their own efforts, this is a DoD priority. SecDef has made it a priority, so everyone is working towards that end. But that's where I think we need to go, and that's where I see us going.
All right, thanks. Keith, a couple minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks, Ahmad. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I believe strongly the AI and ML is really the next wave, and to the extent that bot wars isn't that far off, right? Your AI countering their AI quicker than they can react. It's a much different game, and to kind of get there, what I've seen, and especially from an industry perspective, is there's a rush to be digital across the services. And that has specific meaning to some people. They mean certain things when they say, I want to be a digital force. And in the context of convergence, you have to have that infrastructure, as we kind of talked about, to be able to do those things. But one of the things that I think is been proven and is fundamentally, don't want to lose sight of in a very technical discussion, is that some of the basic blocking and tackling have to be done about your work, your workforce, and your workplace. So the people you're bringing in, we talked about training, you have to be trained. You've got to bring the right talent into your organizations and have a strategy about how you keep and sustain them and grow them and put them in the right places in the organization. You've got to, have the right mission, tradecraft, and capabilities there. But you've also got to build a culture around all this. And I've seen lots of times people inherently understand culture is important, and you want a culture that is one where you're innovating and you're taking advantage of AI and ML. But at the same time, culture doesn't just happen. It can, right? But you may not get the culture you want. You'll get a culture. And so what we're seeing is a real need to help organizations put culture in place, to get the people in the right mind frame and position to be able to start delivering some of these converged effects. Because without that, like I said, it's easy to want to dive in and start putting analytics on your network and do things like that. But it's got to be, at least from an industry perspective, part of a much bigger and comprehensive strategy if you want it to scale and sort of give you enterprise capabilities that endure. And so to me, that's one of the areas where I think there's a ton of promise, is that we're seeing the services kind of take that on and realize that that's a challenge that they need to deal with, and start getting after some of those basics, the foundational capabilities that enable ultimately the convergence on the mission and operation side that you have to have to defend your networks, to keep your ability to deliver effects protected, and to deliver the ones you want where you want them at the time and place of your choosing, and to deter aggression. So I'm very hopeful. The growth and the scale of the tools that are available to enable those types of things are amazing. And to me, it brings a lot of optimism about what's possible and what's coming in the world of cyber and intel convergence as we move ahead.
Thanks, Keith. I want to thank our panelists today. We've just scratched the surface on this topic. Didn't get to a lot of the audience questions. I apologize for that. But a great discussion between Keith and Ahmad, and very appreciative to them and to AFCEA for letting us have this panel. And I guess with that, Rich, we'll push it back over to you. I know that we've got a pretty important speaker coming up.
Thanks, Mike. We appreciate you and your panel taking your time to be with us today and helping us share some of those insights, and to Deloitte for being such a great sponsor year after year, helping us have this symposium each year and encourage these types of interactions between government, industry, military, and of course support our STEM education efforts through this forum here. So thanks again to you and your panel. We'll be sending you one of those custom chapter embossed notebooks as a kind of a memento of your participation here today, and look forward to having you guys back maybe in future years in person. So thanks again.
All right. Thanks.
Okay, folks. As Mike mentioned, we have a quick turn between here and the next panel. So if you would just immediately scroll one down on your agenda, click into that session. We have Lieutenant General Tim Hawk with a special panel on delivering innovation that you're not going to miss. So I'll see you in just a few seconds on the next stream. Thanks.